So this is a bike built to cross creeks and rivers and climb mountains. But adventure comes in many forms. And today we'll see what it's like when the KTM 890 Adventure faces something, well, a little less glamorous. Singapore traffic, tropical humidity, and an underground car park clearly designed by someone with unresolved anger issues toward motorcycles. But first, the important numbers, because nothing says adventure like a good spec sheet. The engine is an 889cc parallel twin. Seat height is 830 millimeters. Weight is 215 kilograms wet. Peak power is 105 horsepower at 8,000 RPM. Peak torque is 100 Newton meters at 6,500 RPM. Fuel capacity is 20 liters. And the price of the bike is $43,000 on the road. So as mentioned, this is the standard 890 Adventure, not the R model. And this variant runs a 20-liter tank that's slung quite low on both sides of the bike. And this does contribute quite a bit to its stability, especially its low speed stability. Up front you get WP Apex 43mm open cartridge forks with about 200mm of travel. It's non-adjustable, at least not for preload, but at least it's paired with a WP Apex shock at the back, which is fully adjustable, including a remote preload adjuster. So being the base model is not quite as hardcore as the setup found on the R model. But for railroad roads and mixed surfaces, this might be the one you'd rather have day to day. So the bike looks tall and imposing, but in reality it has a seat height of just 830 millimeters, which basically makes it about average, slightly above average height, which is a pleasant surprise for a nice big adventure bike such as this, at least in theory. Sitting on the bike, the seat is quite narrow, and because of the low slung fuel tank, the balance is excellent. The only problem is that even though it's listed as 830 millimeters, it does feel a bit taller than those numbers might indicate. My legs are almost at full extension. I can touch down on both sides, but not without much authority or confidence. And trying to push the bike while seated reveals that truth. With my knees almost fully straight, there's really no leverage, no squat, no power. When I try to inch the bike forward, it's as if I'm pushing a sofa with my thumbs. At a slight incline that's in this alleyway, and I quickly realized that it's probably much better to get off and push. That's going to be faster and definitely less frustrating. And in all honesty, this is about the only time that I feel the bike's true weight, all 215 kilograms worth. On the move, the weight basically disappears, and the engine is surprisingly flexible. In stop and go traffic, the heat does seem to build up a bit. It's noticeable but not quite unbearable, just enough to remind you that it's working pretty hard. For low speed traffic and high speed cruising, the engine adapts effortlessly. Cruising along at 60 km in top gear, that's something totally manageable with this KTM. And yet when you open the throttle, the mid-range torque kicks in exactly where you need it. The riding position is adventure bike comfortable. It's something you sit in rather than on. The handlebars, the foot pegs, the overall stance. It really feels all day friendly. Again, this bike has a very confidence inspiring low speed handling. It feels very planted and controlled at low speeds, and I think a lot of it has to do with its relatively lower center of gravity. The fueling is clean as well, no surging, no hesitation or gear confusion. Acceleration is smooth, predictable and always eager. You simply choose the pace you want to ride at, and this bike just adapts. And I really do like its versatility and ability to do different speeds without complaint. Mid-range grunt, as mentioned, is strong. Open the throttle and it responds and surges forward instantly. Even crawling about at 10 km/h, that low center of gravity and balance weight make it feel manageable and really non-intimidating. Okay, now for the no throttle test. First gear, clutch out, hands off the throttle and the bike just moves forward. Into second, same story. Into third, and then into fourth. Again, no lurching, no complaints, no kangaroo moments. The 890 is just so predictable and easy to ride. And you know that it's not going to stall on you if you're a little bit clumsy or ham-fisted with the throttle at slow speeds. Some adventure bikes, because of their geometry, tend to go very light at the front when you're going up tight spiral ramps. And as you try to steer the bike, it tends to fight you and push you toward the outer walls. I was expecting a little bit of that kind of sensation on this bike, yet this 890 surprisingly stays composed, and it tracks predictably and it tracks tightly following the apex of this bend. And it really does feel surprisingly small for such a somewhat tall 900cc machine. Yet at highway speeds it behaves like a much larger adventure bike, calm, planted and perfectly happy cruising all day. Even in sweeping high-speed turns, it feels surprisingly sport bike stable, despite the upright adventure bike appearance and geometry. This bike really is a versatile, competent all-rounder. Now KTM calls this 890 a middleweight adventure bike. The question is based on what? Engine size? Weight? Peak horsepower? Power to weight? Depending on your metric, the KTM could be a small bike, it could be a mid-sized bike, and it could easily be classed as a big bike. Because objectively, this bike is 890cc, weighs 215 kilograms, and produces as much power as an early 90s super bike. So I'm inclined to call it a big bike, or at the very least, to use boxing terminology, it would be a light heavyweight, not a middleweight. It certainly feels a lot closer in size and performance to an Africa Twin than it does a Tenere 700. But the point I'm trying to make is this. If you just ignore all that marketing posturing for a while, this bike is not about having a better middleweight. A bike like the 890, in my opinion, really makes full-size 1200cc, 1300cc adventure bikes feel unnecessary. And about the only time where I might arguably prefer a 1300 adventure over something like this is if I had to cover a lot of highway miles at very high speeds, fully loaded with a passenger. Of course, no talk about KTM parallel twins would be complete without mentioning reliability. Now KTM have revised the LC8C engine After early 790 camware issues, the engine has been updated and uprated with wider finger followers, better oil screening, and so on. So if I understand correctly, most owners of newer 890s report no issues. Of course, you still find the occasional anecdote online, but overall the reliability issues that plague the early 790 parallel twins, on which this 890 is based on, overall those issues seem to have been mostly resolved. And just as well, KTM backs this bike with a 4-year unlimited mileage warranty, which is reassuring if you plan to put a lot of miles on the bike. During my time with this bike, what I am noticing is that this engine is one of the most usable, flexible, torque-rich parallel twins I've ridden. It feels like it will cruise happily all day at 140 km/h and crawl along at 50 km/h in top gear and still deliver arm-stretching mid-range whenever needed. In tight spaces and off-road, I suspect that low center of gravity is going to be a good friend. In the city though, the only fault I can level at this bike is that it can run a little bit warm, and if you're stuck in traffic, stuck at a stop for too long, it can get a bit uncomfortable. And another issue is calling this bike a middleweight. In my opinion, not really. A 900cc is not a middleweight, even though it's an evolution of the 790 Adventure. I think it will be most appealing as an alternative to someone looking to downsize from a big adventure bike rather than someone trying to upsize from a smaller one, because it offers most of the performance of a 1300cc class adventure bike, minus the weight and minus the cost of ownership. And that balance between capability and manageability is exactly what makes this 890 Adventure such an interesting and enjoyable motorcycle to ride, even in the city.